The invoice arrived on a Tuesday morning, and I nearly choked on my coffee when I saw the number at the bottom, $876. My monthly HOA dues had been $438 for the past 3 years at Meadowbrook Estates in Chandler, Arizona. And now they had suddenly doubled without warning or explanation. I set my mug down on the kitchen counter and read through the itemized charges again, searching for some mistake or misprint that would make sense of this absurdity. But there was no mistake. The invoice clearly stated that my new monthly assessment was effective immediately, backdated to the beginning of the quarter. That meant I supposedly owed an additional $1,314 on top of the current month's inflated fee. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the complaint I had filed 2 weeks earlier against Rebecca Everhart, the HOA president, for her repeated violations of our community guidelines and her apparent embezzlement of HOA funds. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. I had moved to Meadowbrook Estates 4 years ago after my divorce, looking for a fresh start in a nice neighborhood with good schools nearby for my weekend visits with my daughter. The community was beautiful, with its manicured lawns, walking trails, and a clubhouse that actually got used for resident events. For the first 3 years, everything had been relatively peaceful. Sure, Rebecca was a bit controlling and liked to flex her authority over minor infractions, but nothing too extreme. That all changed when she started approving contracts for maintenance work to a company called Premium Property Services. I worked as an accountant for a mid-sized firm in Phoenix, so numbers were my specialty. When I reviewed the quarterly financial statements that Rebecca was required to post in the clubhouse, something immediately jumped out at me. Premium Property Services was billing our HOA nearly triple what comparable companies charged for identical services. A simple lawn maintenance contract that should have cost around $15,000 per quarter was running us $42,000. Pool cleaning services were similarly inflated. Over the course of 18 months, Premium Property Services had invoiced our HOA for over $400,000. The red flag became a blazing siren when I did some basic research and discovered that Premium Property Services was owned by Robert Everhart, Rebecca's husband. She had never disclosed this conflict of interest to the board or the residents. When I brought my concerns to the monthly HOA meeting 3 weeks ago, Rebecca had dismissed them immediately, claiming everything was above board and that Premium Property Services offered superior quality that justified the premium pricing. The other board members, Patricia Morton and Dennis Walsh, had nodded along like bobbleheads, clearly intimidated by Rebecca's domineering personality. So I had filed a formal complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate, which oversaw HOA regulations in the state. I also sent copies to every resident in our community of 43 homes, laying out the evidence of what appeared to be systematic fraud. Rebecca had been furious. She showed up at my door the evening after I distributed the complaint, her face flushed red, her hands trembling with rage.
"How dare you spread lies about me and my family?" she had shouted from my front porch while I stood in the doorway. "I have done nothing but serve this community faithfully for 6 years, and this is the thanks I get? You are going to regret this, Kyle. You are going to regret this so much." Now, staring at the doubled invoice, I understood exactly what she meant. This was retaliation, pure and simple. I immediately drafted an email to the entire board, copying all residents, explaining that I had received an invoice doubling my dues without any prior notice, justification, or community vote. Within an hour, I received responses from 6 other residents who had received similar invoices. Every single one of them had signed my original complaint document supporting the investigation into Rebecca's financial dealings. I called my lawyer, Marcus Chen, whom I had retained when I first started looking into the HOA financial irregularities. Marcus had warned me that Rebecca might try something like this. "Kyle, this is exactly the kind of retaliatory behavior that courts take very seriously," Marcus said when I read him the invoice over the phone. "Arizona law is crystal clear that HOAs cannot impose arbitrary fees as punishment for residents exercising their legal rights. We need to document everything and file an injunction immediately." "How fast can we move on this?" I asked, pacing around my living room. "Because I am not paying this fraudulent invoice, which means she is going to try to put a lien on my property or start fining me for non-payment."
I will have the paperwork filed by end of business today, Marcus assured me. In the meantime, do not pay anything beyond your regular dues. Keep records of all communications with the board. And Kyle, be prepared for this to get ugly. People like Rebecca do not back down easily. He was right about that. 2 days after I refused to pay the inflated invoice, I received a certified letter informing me that I was being fined $200 per day for non-payment of assessments. The letter also stated that I was prohibited from using any community amenities, including the pool, clubhouse, and walking trails, until my account was current. When I checked my mailbox the following afternoon, there was a notice stating that the HOA had placed a lien on my property for unpaid fees totaling $3,214. Marcus filed our lawsuit in Maricopa County Superior Court the next morning, naming both Rebecca Everhart personally and the Meadowbrook Estates HOA as defendants. Our complaint alleged breach of fiduciary duty, self-dealing, embezzlement, and unlawful retaliation. We also filed an emergency motion for a temporary restraining order to prevent the HOA from taking any further collection actions against me or the other affected residents while the case was pending. The hearing for the restraining order was scheduled for the following week. In the meantime, Rebecca ramped up her campaign of harassment. She had the locks changed on the community clubhouse and pool area, then sent out an email blast claiming that the facilities needed to be closed for emergency repairs. When several residents questioned why repairs were suddenly necessary, Rebecca claimed that vandalism had occurred and that she had reason to believe I was responsible. She provided no evidence for this accusation, but it was enough to turn some of my neighbors against me. My next-door neighbor, Tom Richardson, stopped me while I was getting my mail one evening. Tom was a retired police officer who had always been friendly, and I could see he was uncomfortable with the conversation he was about to have. "Bruh. Listen, Kyle, I do not know what is really going on between you and Rebecca," he said, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "But this whole situation is tearing the community apart. People are taking sides, there is gossip flying everywhere, and it is just getting nasty. Is there any way you two could work this out privately?" "Tom, I appreciate the concern, but this is not about a personal dispute," I explained. "Rebecca and her husband have been stealing from all of us for over a year. I have the documentation to prove it, and now she's trying to bankrupt me and several other residents because we dared to speak up about it. This has to go through the courts." Tom nodded slowly. "Yeah, I figured it was something like that. For what it is worth, Patricia mentioned to my wife that she is terrified of Rebecca. Said Rebecca threatened to sue her personally if she did not vote the way Rebecca wanted on board matters. I think there are others who would support you if they were not scared." That conversation gave me an idea. If other board members were being intimidated, maybe they would be willing to testify about Rebecca's behavior once they were under oath and had legal protection. I passed this information along to Marcus, who added witness subpoenas for Patricia Morton and Dennis Walsh to our court filings. The day of the restraining order hearing arrived, and I took a personal day from work to attend. The Maricopa County Superior Court building in downtown Phoenix was an imposing structure, and I felt a knot of anxiety in my stomach as Marcus and I walked through security. Rebecca was already in the courtroom when we arrived, accompanied by her lawyer, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit named Gerald Thornton. Rebecca shot me a look of pure venom as I took my seat at the plaintiff's table. Judge Linda Morrison presided over the hearing. She was a no-nonsense woman in her early 60s with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. After both sides presented their opening statements, Judge Morrison addressed Marcus. "Counselor, walk me through the timeline here," she said. "Your client filed a complaint against Mrs. Everhart on what date?" "March 23rd of this year, Your Honor," Marcus replied, standing at the podium. "Mr. O'Brien filed a complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate alleging financial improprieties by the HOA president, specifically regarding contracts awarded to a company owned by Mrs. Everhart's husband. He also distributed information about these concerns to fellow residents." "And when did Mr. O'Brien receive the notice of increased dues?" "April 6th, Your Honor. Exactly 14 days later. The increase doubled his monthly assessment with no prior notice, no community vote, and no explanation beyond a vague reference to increased operational costs." Judge Morrison turned to Gerald Thornton. Counselor, does the HOA dispute this timeline? Thornton stood, smoothing his tie. We do not dispute the dates, Your Honor. However, the increase in assessments was necessary due to unexpected expenses and was applied uniformly across several properties, not just Mr. O'Brien's. This is simply a case of unfortunate timing, not retaliation. Several properties, Judge Morrison repeated, looking down at the documents before her. How many properties received increased assessments, and what criteria was used to determine which properties would be affected? Thornton hesitated, glancing back at Rebecca. 7 properties in total, Your Honor. The criteria was based on property size and location within the community. That is interesting, Marcus interjected, because every single one of those 7 properties belongs to a resident who signed Mr. O'Brien's complaint document. We have submitted the complaint with all signatures as Exhibit C in our motion papers. The correlation is 100%. Additionally, the HOA bylaws require a community vote for any assessment increase exceeding 10%, and they require 30 days written notice. Neither of those requirements was met here. Judge Morrison's expression grew stern as she reviewed the exhibits. She looked up at Thornton, then at Rebecca. Mrs. Everhart, you are the HOA president, correct? Rebecca stood, her voice tight. Yes, Your Honor. I've served this community faithfully for 6 years. Did you personally approve these assessment increases? Yes, with the support of the board. We have the authority to impose special assessments for necessary expenses. Special assessments still require notice and justification, Mrs. Everhart, and they certainly cannot be used as a weapon against residents who exercise their legal right to file complaints. I am granting the temporary restraining order. The HOA is prohibited from collecting any amounts beyond the standard monthly dues from these 7 properties, and the liens must be released immediately. We will schedule a full hearing on the merits for 6 weeks from today. In the meantime, I am ordering the HOA to produce all financial records related to contracts with Premium Property Services, all board meeting minutes from the past 2 years, and any communications regarding the complainant residents. Rebecca's face went pale, then flushed an angry red. As we left the courtroom, I heard her hissing something at her lawyer about appealing the decision, but Thornton was shaking his head, clearly trying to calm her down. That went well, Marcus said as we walked back to the parking garage. Judge Morrison saw right through their justification. But Kyle, you need to be prepared for Rebecca to escalate. She is backed into a corner now, and cornered animals are dangerous. Marcus's prediction proved accurate within 48 hours. I arrived home from work on Thursday evening to find a notice taped to my front door. It was a violation citation claiming that my property was not in compliance with community standards. The list of violations was absurd. Lawn height exceeding permitted limits by 1/4 inch, unauthorized paint color on front door, improper placement of garbage cans, and failure to maintain appropriate landscaping density. The total fine was $1,500, with an additional $100 per day until the violations were corrected. I took photographs of everything with my phone, including time-stamped images showing that my lawn was perfectly maintained. My front door was the exact shade of navy blue that was pre-approved in the community color palette, and my garbage cans were in the same location they had been for 4 years. I sent everything to Marcus, who added it to our growing file of retaliatory actions, but Rebecca was not done. Over the next 2 weeks, I received 3 more violation notices for increasingly petty infractions. My porch light was apparently too bright, my car was parked at a slight angle in my own driveway, and my mailbox post needed repainting despite being in perfect condition. Each notice came with escalating fines. I ignored them all, documenting everything carefully. Other residents who had signed my complaint were receiving similar treatment. Sarah Wellington, a single mother who lived 3 houses down from me, called me in tears one evening. Rebecca had sent her a violation notice claiming that her children's toys in the backyard were visible from the street and constituted an eyesore. The fine was $800. When Sarah tried to appeal the violation at the monthly board meeting, Rebecca had her physically removed from the clubhouse by her husband Robert, who apparently considered himself some sort of community enforcer. "This is insane, Kyle," Sarah sobbed over the phone. I cannot afford these fines. I am barely making ends meet as it is. What am I supposed to do? Do not pay anything, I told her firmly. Forward all the notices to my lawyer. We are building a case that is going to bury Rebecca legally. She is just digging her own grave deeper with every violation notice she sends out. Marcus agreed. This is textbook retaliation. Every single action she is taking is going to support your case. Just keep documenting everything and do not engage with her directly. The full hearing was scheduled for late May, but before that date arrived, something unexpected happened. I received a phone call from Patricia Morton, one of the HOA board members. Her voice was shaking when she spoke. Kyle, I need to talk to you privately. Can we meet somewhere away from the neighborhood? We agreed to meet at a coffee shop in downtown Chandler the next morning. Patricia was already there when I arrived, looking haggard and anxious. She was in her mid-50s, with short blonde hair and worry lines etched deep around her eyes. Thank you for meeting me, she said as I sat down across from her. I do not even know where to start. I'm so sorry for everything that has been happening. I should have spoken up months ago, but I was scared. Scared of what? I asked, though I had a pretty good idea. Scared of Rebecca. Kyle, she is not just controlling, she is vindictive and possibly dangerous. When you first brought up concerns about the premium property services contracts, I knew you were right. I had noticed the same things, but when I privately mentioned to Rebecca that maybe we should get competing bids, she threatened me. She said she had dirt on my husband from his past business dealings and that she would make our lives hell if I did not fall in line. Dennis got similar threats. What kind of dirt? I asked carefully. Patricia shook her head. It does not even matter if it is true or not. My husband had a business partnership that went bad 15 years ago. There was a lawsuit, some allegations of fraud that were never proven. It nearly destroyed our marriage at the time. Rebecca somehow found out about it and has been holding it over our heads. She said she would spread the information around the community and file complaints with professional licensing boards. Patricia, that is extortion. You realize that, right? She nodded miserably. I know, but I was too afraid to do anything about it. Watching what she has done to you and the others has made me realize that she is never going to stop. She's going to keep hurting people until someone stops her legally. I want to help. I will testify about everything, the threats, the financial irregularities, all of it. I just need protection from legal retaliation. I called Marcus immediately and put him on speakerphone. He arranged for Patricia to give a formal statement the next day at his office. Her testimony was damning. She described in detail how Rebecca had systematically intimidated board members, approved fraudulent contracts, and retaliated against anyone who questioned her authority. Patricia also revealed that Rebecca had been secretly recording conversations with residents and board members, using the recordings to gather information she could weaponize later. This changes everything, Marcus said after Patricia left his office. With a board member willing to testify, we have insider corroboration of the entire scheme. I am going to contact the Maricopa County Attorney's Office. What Rebecca has been doing goes beyond civil violations. This is potentially criminal fraud and extortion. 2 days later, a detective from the Chandler Police Department contacted me to schedule an interview. Detective James Rodriguez was a soft-spoken man in his early 40s who specialized in white-collar crime. We met at the police station where I walked him through everything: the inflated contracts, the retaliation, the threats Patricia had described, and the campaign of harassment Rebecca had waged against multiple residents. We have been looking at HOA fraud more seriously in recent years, Detective Rodriguez explained. It is surprisingly common, and the victims often do not report it because they do not realize what is happening constitutes criminal behavior. Based on what you and Mrs. Morton have told us and the financial documents you have provided, I think we have enough to open a formal investigation. This is going to take some time, though. Financial crimes require extensive documentation and analysis. How long are we talking about? I asked. Could be a few months. In the meantime, continue with your civil lawsuit. That actually helps us because the discovery process will generate additional evidence we can use. Just keep us informed of any developments. The civil case proceeded toward the full hearing. Marcus deposed Rebecca, Robert, Dennis, and several other key figures. Rebecca's deposition was a disaster for her case. She was evasive, contradictory, and at times openly hostile. When Marcus asked her directly about the timing of the assessment increases, she claimed it was purely coincidental that all 7 affected properties belonged to complaint signers. When pressed on why no community vote had been taken, she claimed emergency authority that did not actually exist under the HOA bylaws. Robert's deposition was equally problematic. He admitted that Premium Property Services had never submitted competitive bids for any of the contracts they received. When asked why his pricing was significantly higher than market rates, he claimed his company provided superior service but could not articulate any specific differences in scope or quality that justified the premium. He also admitted that he had never disclosed his relationship to the HOA president when negotiating contracts, claiming he assumed everyone already knew. The full hearing took place on a sweltering Tuesday in late May at the Maricopa County Superior Court. Judge Morrison heard testimony from both sides over the course of 2 full days. I testified about discovering the financial irregularities and the immediate retaliation I faced after filing my complaint. Patricia Morton testified about Rebecca's threats and intimidation tactics. Sarah Wellington tearfully described how the harassment had affected her family. Marcus presented a forensic accounting analysis showing that the Meadowbrook Estates HOA had paid approximately $375,000 more than market rates for services provided by Premium Property Services over an 18-month period. Rebecca's lawyer tried to argue that the assessment increases were justified by rising costs and that any similarity to the complaint signers was merely coincidental. He claimed that the violation notices I received were legitimate enforcement of community standards, but Judge Morrison was not buying it. Her questions during cross-examination made it clear she viewed Rebecca's explanations as implausible at best and dishonest at worst. "Mrs. Everhart, let me make sure I understand your testimony," Judge Morrison said during one particularly tense exchange. "You are asking this court to believe that it was pure coincidence that all 7 properties that received doubled assessments belonged to residents who signed a complaint against you. You are asking me to believe that it was pure coincidence that these assessment increases happened exactly 2 weeks after that complaint was filed. You are asking me to believe that you saw no conflict of interest in awarding hundreds of thousands of dollars in contracts to your husband's company without disclosure or competitive bidding. Is that correct?" Rebecca's face was flushed. "Your Honor, I've always acted in the best interests of the community." "That was not my question, Mrs. Everhart. I asked if you are claiming these were all coincidences." "I am saying that the timing was unfortunate, but not intentional," Rebecca said stiffly. Judge Morrison leaned back in her chair. "I am going to be frank with you, Mrs. Everhart. I have been on the bench for 22 years, and I have heard a lot of implausible testimony in that time. But your explanation here strains credulity beyond the breaking point. The pattern of behavior documented in this case demonstrates clear, intentional retaliation against residents who exercised their legal rights. It also demonstrates a systematic scheme to enrich yourself and your husband at the expense of the community you were elected to serve. I am going to take this matter under advisement and issue a written ruling within 2 weeks, but I will say that I find the plaintiff's case compelling and well supported by the evidence." We left the courthouse that day feeling cautiously optimistic. Marcus warned me not to celebrate prematurely, but the judge's comments had been about as favorable as we could hope for. The written ruling arrived exactly 2 weeks later, and it was even better than I had hoped. Judge Morrison issued a comprehensive 43-page opinion that methodically dismantled every aspect of Rebecca's defense. The court found that the HOA had engaged in unlawful retaliation by doubling assessments for residents who had filed complaints. The court found that Rebecca had breached her fiduciary duty by awarding contracts to her husband's company without disclosure and without ensuring competitive pricing. The court found that the subsequent violation notices and fines constituted further retaliation and harassment. The remedies Judge Morrison ordered were extensive. First, the court invalidated all of the increased assessments and ordered the HOA to refund any amounts collected beyond standard dues. Second, the court invalidated all violation notices and fines issued to complaint signers after the date of the original complaint. Third, the court ordered Rebecca to be immediately removed as HOA president and banned from serving in any leadership capacity for the HOA in the future. Fourth, the court ordered the HOA to hire an independent auditor to review all financial transactions for the previous 3 years and to recover any improperly paid funds. Fifth, and most significantly, the court ordered Rebecca and Robert to personally pay damages to each of the 7 affected residents in the amount of $25,000 each, plus attorney fees and costs. "This is a total victory," Marcus said when he called to discuss the ruling. Judge Morrison did not hold back at all. She clearly saw this for exactly what it was: a corrupt official using her position to enrich herself and punish anyone who challenged her authority. The personal liability finding is huge. That is coming out of Rebecca and Robert's own pockets, not the HOA's insurance. But the legal consequences were just beginning. 1 week after Judge Morrison's ruling, the Chandler Police Department executed a search warrant at the Everhart residence. Detective Rodriguez and his team seized computers, financial records, and other evidence related to the HOA fraud investigation. That same day, Rebecca and Robert were both arrested and charged with multiple felonies: theft, fraud, extortion, and abuse of fiduciary position. The local news covered the story extensively. Seeing Rebecca's mugshot on the evening news was surreal after months of her terrorizing the neighborhood. The news coverage triggered responses from residents of other HOAs in the area who had experienced similar problems. Apparently, Rebecca had served on the boards of 2 previous HOAs before Meadowbrook Estates, and both communities reported suspiciously inflated contracts with premium property services during her tenure. The criminal case moved through the system over the following months. The Maricopa County Attorney's Office built an extensive case documenting the financial fraud. Patricia Morton's testimony was crucial, as were the financial records subpoenaed from premium property services and various banks. The prosecution's forensic accountant determined that Rebecca and Robert had illegally obtained approximately $570,000 across 3 different HOA communities over a 5-year period. Facing overwhelming evidence, Robert eventually accepted a plea deal. He agreed to testify against Rebecca, repay his share of the stolen funds, and serve 18 months in prison. Rebecca, stubborn to the end, refused any plea offer and insisted on going to trial. The trial lasted 3 weeks and was covered extensively by local media. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Judge Thomas Brennan, who presided over the criminal trial, sentenced Rebecca to 6 years in state prison, followed by 5 years of probation. He also ordered her to pay full restitution to all affected HOA communities, which totaled over $500,000 after interest and penalties. During the sentencing hearing, Judge Brennan delivered a scathing rebuke of Rebecca's conduct. Mrs. Everhart, you were elected to a position of trust by your neighbors, Judge Brennan said from the bench. They relied on you to manage their community fairly and honestly. Instead, you systematically looted their resources for personal gain. When residents dared to question your conduct, you retaliated against them with a cruelty that is genuinely shocking. You weaponized your authority to try to destroy the lives of people whose only crime was expecting honesty from their elected representative. This court finds your conduct to be particularly egregious and deserving of substantial incarceration. Rebecca showed no emotion as she was led away in handcuffs. Robert was already serving his sentence at a minimum security facility. Their house in Meadowbrook Estates was put up for sale to help satisfy the restitution orders, though it was unclear whether the proceeds would come close to covering what they owed. In the aftermath of the criminal convictions, the Meadowbrook Estates HOA underwent significant reforms. Patricia Morton was elected as the new president on a platform of transparency and accountability. One of her first acts was to implement new bylaws requiring competitive bidding for all contracts over $5,000, mandatory financial audits by independent firms, and term limits for board positions. She also established a resident oversight committee with the authority to review board decisions and access financial records. The independent audit ordered by Judge Morrison uncovered an additional $78,000 in questionable expenses that had not been part of the original investigation. Most of these involved inflated prices for supplies and services from vendors who turned out to have personal relationships with Rebecca. The HOA successfully recovered about 40% of these funds through settlements with the vendors. My own life slowly returned to normal, though the experience had changed me in ways I had not fully anticipated. The stress of the legal battles had taken a toll. I'd lost 15 pounds, developed stress-related insomnia, and found myself constantly on edge, waiting for the next attack from Rebecca. Even after she was in prison, it took months before I could fully relax when I came home. The relationship with my daughter Emma had suffered too. She was only 9 years old, and while I tried to shield her from the details, she could sense something was wrong during our weekend visits. One Saturday afternoon, about 2 months after Rebecca's sentencing, we were having lunch at her favorite pizza place when she finally asked me directly about what had been happening. "Dad, are you okay?" Emma asked, looking at me with those serious brown eyes that reminded me so much of her mother. "You seem sad all the time now." I set down my slice of pizza and took a deep breath. "I am sorry, sweetheart. Things have been stressful with some problems in my neighborhood, but they are getting better now. I should not have let it affect our time together." "Mom said you were fighting with some mean lady who was stealing from people," Emma said matter-of-factly. "She said you did the right thing by stopping her, even though it was hard." Hearing that from Emma, knowing that her mother had explained the situation in those terms, meant more to me than I could express. My ex-wife Jennifer and I had our differences, but she had always been fair about co-parenting, and apparently she had used this situation as a teaching moment for Emma about standing up for what was right. "Your mom is correct," I told Emma. "Sometimes doing the right thing is really hard and it can be scary, but it is important to stand up when you see people being hurt or treated unfairly. I hope you will remember that as you grow up." Emma nodded seriously, then went back to her pizza, satisfied with the explanation. That conversation was a turning point for me. I realized I had been so focused on the legal battles and the stress that I had lost perspective on why I had started this fight in the first place. It was not just about the money or even about punishing Rebecca. It was about refusing to let bullies and corrupt officials get away with hurting people just because they had some authority. The other residents who had been targeted by Rebecca's retaliation also gradually recovered. Sarah Wellington's violations were all dismissed, and she received $25,000 in damages from the court judgment, plus an additional $12,000 from her share of the recovered audit funds. She used the money to set up college savings accounts for her kids and to finally fix the leaking roof she had been putting off for years. "Kyle, I cannot thank you enough," Sarah told me when we ran into each other at the community mailboxes one evening. "When this all started, I thought I was going to lose my house. Rebecca had me so scared. But you stood up to her, and that gave the rest of us the courage to do the same. You literally changed our lives." I appreciated her gratitude, but the truth was that everyone who had joined the complaint had shown courage. They had stood up despite facing intimidation and financial threats. That kind of solidarity was what had ultimately brought Rebecca down. She had counted on people being too afraid or too isolated to fight back effectively, and she had been wrong. The community as a whole became much more engaged in HOA governance after the scandal. Attendance at monthly meetings went from typically a dozen residents to regularly exceeding 30. People actually read the financial statements now and asked informed questions. The new board operated with a level of transparency that would have been unimaginable under Rebecca's regime. Meeting minutes were posted online within 24 hours. Contracts were openly bid with multiple proposals presented to residents for feedback. It was not perfect, but it was dramatically better. About a year after Rebecca's sentencing, I attended a community barbecue at the clubhouse. It was a beautiful evening in October, with temperatures finally dropping below 90 degrees after a brutal Arizona summer. Patricia had organized the event as a way to help rebuild community bonds that had been fractured during the scandal. There was a good turnout, with families playing in the pool area while adults gathered around picnic tables laden with food. Tom Richardson, my retired police officer neighbor, approached me while I was loading up a plate with hamburger and potato salad. "Kyle, I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. When all this started, I thought you were just stirring up trouble over nothing. I told you to let it go and work things out privately. I was wrong. Rebecca was a criminal, and you were right to pursue it the way you did. I'm sorry I did not support you earlier. Tom, you do not need to apologize, I said. Nobody knew how bad it really was at first. Even I did not realize the full extent until we started digging into the finances. The important thing is that it is over now, and the community is stronger for it. Maybe, Tom said thoughtfully, but it should not have taken one person being willing to risk everything to expose it. The rest of us should have been paying better attention. I was a cop for 30 years, and I completely missed criminal activity happening right under my nose in my own neighborhood. That is embarrassing. Well, you're paying attention now, I pointed out. I have seen you at every board meeting for the past 6 months. That matters. We chatted for a while longer. Then I made my way over to where Emma was playing with some other kids in the pool. She had become friends with Sarah's daughter Madison during our weekend visits, and the two of them were engaged in an elaborate game that seemed to involve diving for pool toys. Watching her laugh and play without any of the worry that had clouded her earlier visits reminded me why all the stress and conflict had been worth it. This was my home now, and I had fought to protect it not just for myself, but for everyone who lived here. As the evening wound down and families started packing up to head home, Patricia clinked a fork against her glass to get everyone's attention. The crowd quieted down, and she stood up to address the gathering. Thank you all for coming tonight, Patricia said, her voice carrying across the pool area. This has been a difficult year for our community, but I think we have come through it stronger and more united. I want to particularly thank Kyle O'Brien for having the courage to speak up when he saw something wrong, even though he knew there would be consequences. Kyle, would you stand up for a moment? I felt my face flush as I stood awkwardly while people applauded. I was not comfortable being the center of attention, but I appreciated the sentiment behind the gesture. Kyle refused to look the other way when he discovered financial fraud, Patricia continued. He stood up despite facing retaliation, harassment, and intimidation. His actions ultimately led to reforms that have made our community better for everyone. That is the definition of good citizenship, and we are lucky to have him as a neighbor. More applause followed, and several people came over afterward to shake my hand and thank me personally. It was gratifying, but also a little overwhelming. I had not done this for recognition. I had done it because it was necessary and because nobody else was willing to take the lead. But I suppose it was nice to have the community acknowledge that the fight had been worthwhile. The civil judgment against Rebecca and Robert remained largely unsatisfied. Despite the court orders and the criminal restitution requirements, actually collecting the money proved difficult. They had spent lavishly during their years of fraud, and their assets were limited. The sale of their house covered about 30% of what they owed. Robert's business, Premium Property Services, was dissolved and its assets liquidated, yielding another small portion. But the bulk of the judgment remained unpaid and likely would remain so for years. Marcus explained that this was frustratingly common in fraud cases. You can get all the judgments in the world, he said, but if the defendants do not have assets to seize, you are not going to collect. Rebecca will probably be making minimum monthly payments for the rest of her life and will never pay off the full amount. At least you got the principal victory and the reforms implemented. He was right, of course. The money had never been the main point. The important thing was that Rebecca had been stopped, punished, and removed from any position where she could hurt people again. The reforms Patricia had implemented would prevent anyone else from pulling the same scheme in the future. And other HOA communities in the area had taken notice, implementing their own transparency measures and oversight committees. The Maricopa County Attorney's Office used the case as an example in a public awareness campaign about HOA fraud. They produced a brochure that was distributed to HOAs throughout the county, explaining warning signs of fraud and how residents could protect themselves. Detective Rodriguez told me that they had received dozens of tips about potential fraud at other communities following the publicity around Rebecca's case. You have no idea how common this is, he said when we met for coffee one afternoon to wrap up some final documentation. HOAs handle billions of dollars collectively, and the oversight is often minimal. People like Rebecca know they can get away with it because most residents do not have the time, expertise, or will to investigate. What made your case different was that you had the financial knowledge to spot the fraud, the determination to pursue it, and the courage to keep fighting when she tried to destroy you. That combination is rare. Life continued to improve gradually as the months passed. My insomnia resolved itself, and I regained the weight I had lost during the stressful months of legal battles. Work at the accounting firm was going well, and I had been promoted to senior accountant with a corresponding raise. Emma was thriving in school, and our weekend visits had returned to being the highlight of my week. The neighborhood felt genuinely peaceful for the first time since I had moved in. About 18 months after Rebecca's sentencing, I attended a conference in Phoenix on forensic accounting techniques. During one of the break sessions, I was approached by a woman who introduced herself as Rachel Emerson, a reporter for a local news station. "Mr. O'Brien, I covered your HOA case extensively when it was going through the courts," she said. "I have been following up on the impact, and I would love to interview you about the experience and what lessons other HOA residents can learn from it. Would you be willing to participate in a segment?" I was initially reluctant, having had enough of public attention to last a lifetime. But Rachel explained that they wanted to do an educational piece about HOA fraud prevention, and that my perspective as someone who had successfully fought back could help others in similar situations. Marcus encouraged me to do it, saying it would further cement the precedent the case had established. The interview took place the following week at my house. Rachel and her cameraman spent about 2 hours filming, covering everything from how I first noticed the financial irregularities to the retaliation I faced and the eventual court victory. The segment aired as part of a special investigative report on HOA fraud across Arizona, featuring interviews with prosecutors, other victims, and legal experts. The response to the broadcast was significant. I received dozens of emails and phone calls from HOA residents across the state describing similar situations in their communities. Many were facing retaliation for questioning board decisions. Others had discovered financial irregularities but did not know how to proceed. I referred them all to Marcus, who had developed a specialty in HOA litigation following our case. "You started a movement," Marcus joked during one of our periodic check-in calls. "I have picked up 11 new HOA fraud cases in the past 6 months, all directly resulting from people seeing that news segment or hearing about your case. State legislators are even talking about introducing new laws to increase HOA oversight and protect whistleblowers." The idea that the nightmare I had endured might lead to systematic reforms that would protect others made it all feel worthwhile. One of the new cases Marcus had taken on involved a situation almost identical to mine. An HOA president had awarded inflated contracts to her family members and then retaliated against residents who complained. But this time, those residents had a roadmap to follow, established legal precedent to rely on, and a lawyer who had successfully litigated this exact type of case before. 2 years after Judge Morrison's initial ruling in my favor, I attended a community meeting where residents voted on a proposed amendment to the HOA bylaws. The amendment would create a permanent financial oversight committee with the authority to review all contracts, audit financial statements, and investigate resident complaints independently of the board. It was the kind of structural reform that would make future fraud much more difficult to perpetrate. The vote was unanimous in favor. As I looked around the room at my neighbors, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. This community that had been torn apart by corruption and retaliation had come together to ensure it could never happen again. We had learned the hard way that vigilance was essential, that transparency mattered, and that ordinary residents had both the right and the responsibility to hold their elected leaders accountable. After the meeting adjourned, I walked home under a clear Arizona night sky studded with stars. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful in a way it had not been during those dark months when Rebecca was waging her campaign of revenge. My house stood before me, the property I had fought so hard to protect. The lawsuit, the stress, the harassment, the financial uncertainty, all of it had been worth it to preserve my home and my community. I thought about Rebecca, sitting in prison for another 4 years, her reputation destroyed, her criminal record permanent. I felt no joy in her suffering, but no regret either. She had been given authority and had chosen to abuse it. She had been challenged and had chosen retaliation over reform. The consequences she faced were entirely of her own making. Inside my house, I poured myself a bourbon and sat on the back patio, looking out over the community pool area lit by soft landscape lighting. In a few days, Emma would be here for the weekend, and we had plans to go hiking in South Mountain Park. Life was good again, normal again. The battles were over, the victories secured, the reforms implemented. But I also knew that I would never be quite as trusting or naive as I had been before all this started. I would always read the HOA financial statements carefully. I would always attend the board meetings and ask questions. I would always remember that corruption flourishes in darkness and that the price of a functional community was eternal vigilance. The ice clinked in my glass as I took a sip, savoring the burn of good whiskey. Somewhere in the distance, I heard children laughing as a family walked past on the community trail. A gentle breeze carried the scent of desert flowers. The nightmare was over, but the lessons remained, and I was determined that those lessons would not be forgotten by me or by anyone else who called Meadowbrook Estates home. In the end, the entire ordeal had cost me approximately $40,000 in legal fees, despite recovering attorney fees in the judgment. It had cost me months of stress and anxiety. It had strained relationships and consumed countless hours that I could never get back. But it had also saved my community hundreds of thousands of dollars in ongoing fraud. It had resulted in real prison time for corrupt officials. It had established legal precedent that would protect other HOA residents in similar situations. And it had transformed a passive, disengaged community into one that actively participated in its own governance. Those outcomes were worth every dollar spent, every sleepless night endured, every moment of confrontation with Rebecca's fury. Justice had prevailed, not because the system was perfect, but because ordinary people were willing to fight for it. That was a lesson worth learning, worth remembering, and worth passing on to the next generation. As I sat there on my patio, finishing my drink and enjoying the peaceful evening, I knew that I had done the right thing. And that knowledge, more than any court judgment or public recognition, was what truly mattered.